I am in charge of talking to people about the Whipple Museum, which is much more fun. So, I know some of you have been to the Whipple Museum. Paul is doing a great job at getting people to the Whipple Museum and at getting me to see you. But it is quite hard to find. So it's on Free School Lane. It's about 5 minutes walk from here. I've just done it. There are no crocodiles. It's all fine. However, when you get there, it tells you in letters of stone that it's the Laboratory of Physical Chemistry. Because it was 90 years ago, and it's a listed building. So we can't change that. We have a tiny sign here that says, it's the Whipple Museum. Do come in. And mostly when we're open, we have a sign on the door which says, yes, push the door. Because, it's quite hard. I mean, to explain to people in the university can be quite difficult. That if you arrive at a huge, closed oak door, and it says it's a chemistry laboratory, you might not go in looking for the museum. But do come in. If you want the accessible entrance at the back, it's even worse. So you go past the Zoology Museum and you look down this little alley, and there's usually 2 vans parked here, and it looks like a place you should not be. However, if you keep going and turn the corner at the bottom, you will find our door at the back. And once you get in, we're very friendly. It just takes a little bit of effort. And the Whipple Museum is the Whipple Museum because it was the collection of Robert Whipple, who used to run the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. And he really loved scientific instruments. It's nothing to do with Frank Whittle. It's not Wimpole Hall. It is the Whipple Museum. And this is our main gallery. So it used to be a school. So it's on Free School Lane, and it was the free school. It was the start of the Purse School, which still exists, but is no longer free. So we've got this beautiful Jacobean ceiling, and it's big enough to have our instruments. So these are the things that I am not allowed to put on my bicycle and bring out. So we have the grand orrery. There will be a lot of quite technical words, because it's a history of science museum. If there's a word you don't know, you will probably never need it again. So an orrery is a model of the solar system, but no one's ever going to ask you about that. We have a giant telescope. We have a clock which goes off about every 18 minutes. It's a small replica, and so because of the way the machinery works, it goes off all the time. It is a genuine 24-hour clock. So if you look at the front of it, 12 is at the bottom, and then it goes round to 24. And whenever I need to talk about this case, it strikes 24. But it's a very interesting clock. Then we have My World. This is the learning gallery. So it's moved around a bit. I need to get a new photo. But this is where we do all of our children's activities. And if you have children that you're looking after and you bring them, we have lots of boxes of scientific things that they can experiment with. They're not allowed to play with the giant telescope, but they can play with things in the learning gallery. This is the special exhibitions gallery. At the moment, this is our 75th anniversary exhibition, which is a bit of a cheat because it's now properly our 80th anniversary exhibition. But the 75th anniversary was November 2019, and then in 2020, not many people came to the museum. So we've left it up, and everything in here was collected by Mr. Whipple himself. So this telescope here is the first thing he ever collected. He went to France in an antique shop, he bought that for 10 francs, and then it got a bit out of hand. And by the end, he had 1,000 scientific objects and 1,000 scientific books, and he gave them to the university. I don't know, but I suspect his children might have said that they didn't want 1,000 scientific objects. And so we have his collection. It is an interesting one because we say we are the Whipple Museum of the History of Science, and actually we are the Whipple Museum of shiny things that Mr. Whipple liked, and that's not the same. So most part of my job is to try and tell a global, inclusive history of science using a collection which is mostly instruments made between 1700 and 1900 by French, British or German men. So it's an interesting one to try and work all of that way through. And then upstairs we have the Globes Gallery and the Victorian Parlour. The Globes is kind of an accidental collection for us. We had a few. I mean, Mr. Whipple really liked telescopes and microscopes, not so into globes. And then a few people gave us more globes, and then we became the museum who collected globes. And now we have hundreds of them. Not as many globes as calculators. Our biggest collection is the pocket calculators. We have more than 700 pocket calculators. Last summer we had an intern who spent the whole summer cataloguing and repacking pocket calculators. But she did apply for that job. She did know that was going to happen. So, I have brought you some objects, a history of science in 10 objects. 10 because then I can remember and count them in and I don't lose anything, because that's always embarrassing. These objects, people always say, well, how do you pick 10 objects to tell the whole history of science? And I had about half an hour to decide in 2020 when they suddenly said, you're all going home, you need to take some stuff. So these 10 objects, because they all fit in that box, and that box fits in my bike pannier. So they are small, they are also fairly robust, which means that we can handle them. So at the end, you can come and have a go, have a look at the things more closely. But there are many, many other objects I could have brought. It just needs to be a sensible set of things. And we're going to start early. We're going to start with the abacus. So the first 3 things I have are replicas, and then all of the rest are genuine. So the abacus, well, I've said it's the oldest thing. This one is, of course, quite new. We bought it in the USA. I don't know why we bought it in the USA. It just says in the catalogue that it was bought in the USA, but still very much used today in lots of places in East Asia. So when we have visitors, often the British people will look at the calculators and say, I had one of these at school. And then the people from China or Japan will say, I had an abacus. Often no one can remember how to use any of them, but they are an amazing piece of kit and a reminder that science was happening everywhere, all over the world. So the story we tell in Britain, as it may not surprise you, very much suggests that it's very much a British story, science, but we do try and make sure we talk about science from all over the place. Because for quite a long time, Britain was not really in the forefront of what was going on. Oh, there we go, let's go forwards. So the oldest things we have in the museum are generally navigational instruments and clocks. So the very oldest thing is an Egyptian sundial, which we borrowed from the Fitzwilliam, and that's about 3,000 years old. But the next oldest thing are the astrolabes. This is a replica astrolabe. If I had a real astrolabe, it would be worth about £500,000, and I would be being followed by security. So it's not real, but it is a copy of one that we know what it was. So this is from one that was made by Dia al-Din Muhammad in 1647, and he lived in Lahore, which is now Pakistan, and he made astrolabes. He was the 9th generation of his family to be an instrument maker. So astrolabes are particularly common in Islamic countries because you need to know where you are and what time it is much more if you have to pray 5 times a day pointing in the right direction. if you are a European peasant, even in 1647, essentially, if it's daylight, you should be at work, and if it's dark, you should be asleep, and if the church bell is ringing, you should be in church. But otherwise, you don't really need to know that it's 3:30. And so these are very effective pieces of kit. They're quite complicated. My friend who works with these calls it the medieval smartphone. So you can do loads of things with it. You can find, if you know what time it is, you can find out where you are. If you know where you are, you can find out what time it is. I've never managed to make it play me a video of a cat playing the piano, but there we go. So we have that. And then this one is our last replica. This is a horizontal inclining dial and a leather pouch. So yeah. And this is very pretty. Most of the things in the museum are things that have not been used. This is a thing with all kinds of museums, because if you use it, it gets broken and dirty and you throw it away or you lose it. So most of the things we have are not used. This is a size that could be used. So if people had one, there are some very exciting kind of navigational instruments in the museum, but they're big and heavy. And if you're packing to go on a ship, you want things to be small. So this is about the right size, and it's a compass and then a sundial, but we also have this bit, because if you are sailing, as your latitude changes, your sundial stops working, because the angle to the sun is different from where you started off, which is one of many scientific discoveries that I'm glad I wasn't the person who found that out. So as you move around the world, you need to adjust your sundial so that it will still tell you the correct time. There we go. And then we are into the things that are real. This is a telescope. We have a lot of telescopes. This one is interesting because it has a design flaw. So a thing that happens often in science, that this man, so G. Wilson, who made this telescope, he solved a problem, but he created a new and different problem by solving the problem that he was solving. So the problem he was solving is that people always lose the little lens cap. The big one isn't so bad, it's quite big, it's hard to lose it, but you can lose the little one. So on this telescope, you cannot lose the lens cap. It is built into the telescope, and you move it by flicking it with your fingernail. However, what that means is that there is a small spike just where your eye goes, which is always exciting when you're working with children. I think that Mr. Wilson wore glasses, as all sensible people do, and so it wasn't a problem for him at all. The telescope doesn't work very well. I can see a little bit, but the glass goes cloudy after a while, so it's about 150 years old. We're not quite sure, and usually we don't know exactly how old things are, which is annoying because that's always what people ask. But generally speaking, if you do have a date written on an old scientific instrument, it may well be a forgery because people don't usually write the dates. If you make something, you might put your name on it, so we can date this from when G. Wilson was active because he did put his name on it. But if there's a date, then often you're looking at a forgery, or you get interesting scientific puzzles, like there are 12 astrolabes with the same maker and the same date written on them, and so at least 11 of them are fake. Because you can't make 12 astrolabes by hand in a day. It doesn't happen. So, it may be that they're all fakes and they're copying each other, or you end up with a mystery where you're trying to find the one that is real. People don't like the idea of fakes in science, so we have a set of prisms in the museum which are definitely absolutely nothing to do with Isaac Newton. So they were reputed to be Isaac Newton's prisms, and so we had them scientifically looked at, and the glass dates from 200 years after Newton died, which we thought would be conclusive, nothing to do with Isaac Newton. People still ask to come and see them, and then we say, no, they're 200 years later, you can't, there's nothing to do with Isaac Newton. And they say, we just want to come and see the thing that might belong. It's like, but it doesn't. So it's really interesting. People do want that. We do have Charles Darwin's microscope, which I'm not allowed to put in a box and bring out for people to see. So that's definitely his. We do know about that. So we have our telescope. When I take this to see children, they always say, did it belong to a pirate? Which I would not have thought of as a question. When I ask questions about 19th century telescopes, is it a pirate, does not come to me. But it's an interesting philosophical question. It was almost certainly used on a British ship in the 19th century. British ships in the 19th century would take anything from anyone that they thought they could get away with. So probably yes. But what the child is asking is, did this belong to someone with a parrot on one shoulder and a peg leg? And the answer to that is no. So, we have, I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I don't want to end up with doing yoga. I'm sure it's lovely, but so this one is very complicated, but it says it's simple. It's the botanical microscope. So this is the one I've set up here. And again, it's really posh. Most of the things we have are very posh. This has got inside, it's got satin and velvet, and on the outside it's got shagreen, which is fish skin, because they wanted it to be waterproof. And if you're a fish, you have to be waterproof or you will explode. So fish skin is waterproof. We'll talk about tortoise shell in a minute. Natural materials were often used to make things waterproof. And it's a very simple microscope. It's basically a magnifying glass on a stick, and you put your thing in and you can look at it. But it's this beautiful little box. And people do like having extra things in the boxes. We have boxes with hundreds and hundreds of bits for a microscope, and everyone always uses essentially the same 3. And you never have those because they go missing at the end. This is my favourite thing in the museum's collection. If they annoy me, this is the one that's going home in my pocket. Yeah. But I've said that in public so many times that they will know. It is a spyglass. And it comes out like that. And it's just very beautiful. It is made of tortoise shell. So tortoise shell is usually actually the shell of a turtle, because turtles are apparently delicious. And so people kept eating turtles, don't eat turtles, and so they had the shells, and again, it's waterproof, because if you're a turtle, that is useful. So we've got our tortoise shell, and you can look at things, and it's exactly the same technology as the telescope, it's just much smaller. And you also get a lot of social history with these. So you can be rude to people with these. If I decide I don't like what Jane is wearing, I can look her up and down and then say nothing. And that's called quizzing someone. It's very rude, I do apologise. But you could do that from across the room and just tell someone, I don't like this, the rudest thing you can do in the 18th century. It's also social history. I talk a lot about women in science. And these were often designed for women because, of course, you don't want to wear your glasses because you might look intelligent and nobody wants that in a woman. And so if you do actually have to read something, you can have your spyglass, and it's jewellery, so it's all right. I'm glad we've moved on a bit from there. So we've got our lovely little spyglass. Mr. Whipple really did love optics, so we do have a lot of things to look through. And this is the opera glasses. Which means I do quite often have to explain to children what opera is and why you wouldn't just sit near enough to the front to be able to see. But they are interesting in terms of materials history because this is Bakelite. which is very early plastic. And actually, plastic is a huge problem in museums. I mean, it's a huge problem for the planet as well. The problem now is mostly that it doesn't break down, but the problem with anything really quite late, some of the 1970s plastics are the worst, is that it just crumbles. So we have little bags in our stores which say, this is a protractor, and it's not, it's just a little pile of dust. And we keep them because we want to try and work out why that happened and how we can stop it happening to everything. But people do sometimes they say, oh, in the stores, have you got all the treasures that you're hiding? It's like, no, the treasures are in the main gallery. The little piles of dust that used to be a ruler once, that's what's in the stores. And, you know, the extra 80 microscopes that Mr. Whipple collected that we don't think everyone needs to see all the time. This one is a very culturally specific one, and it works if you were in Britain in 1971. Apologies, I realise that won't necessarily apply to many of you, but it's a really interesting part of how calculating machines work with real life. So this is a very small calculating machine to do a very specific calculation. So in 1971, the currency changed in Britain. So we went out of all of the, you know, there's 20 shillings to a pound and there's 12, I don't know any of these things. So we went from 12s and 20s and all sorts of things to a decimal currency system. And people worried that the shops would use that to put prices up. So what they wanted to do was to check what the price would be. And that's not a straightforward calculation, but you can use a calculator very easily. So what you would do is you would find that something was listed at 28 pence, and you put the 25 next to the 3 to make 28, and you discover that that is 5 shillings and 7 pence, and then you can decide whether that's a reasonable price to pay for whatever that is. And this is quite a rare object in our collection, because people don't give us things like this. People often try to give us microscopes. We've got microscopes. We've got so many microscopes. Sometimes we do still want extra microscopes, but usually only if they have a specific connection to someone in Cambridge who is actually using the microscope. But they don't give us things like this. We don't have much. We've just got a new exhibition on glassware, so kind of chemistry things. And we don't actually have much of that, because it usually gets broken. So this is a rare thing, but it's a slightly odd one. Then we have another microscope, well, my own microscope apart from that one, which does not look like a microscope. Sometimes I do a little quiz and I say, what do you think it is? And the most popular answer is usually stapler. So this is a really interesting example of somebody going back and inventing something a second time, which is actually quite hard to do. So microscopes are discovered, and they sort of, you can probably imagine one in your head, and they sort of look the same for about 300 years. And they're made of brass and glass, and they have lots of moving parts. And Mr. MacArthur, who invented this microscope, was doing work in Africa. He was trying to solve the problem of malaria, and he kept breaking his microscopes. So microscopes are quite fussy. They don't like it too hot or too wet. They don't like sand or mud or any of the things that might happen to you. And of course, every time he broke a microscope, he had to send back to the UK for another microscope, and it took a long time for the message to get there and a long time for the microscope to get back to him. And so he invented this, which is basically trying to make sure that no bits can get into it and that it's not reliant on a particular temperature. Originally he was making them in metal, and then they were made in plastic, and accidentally he also made a very cheap microscope. Before that, microscopes were always expensive, so Charles Darwin's microscope in 1846 was £34, which would have been about 3 years' wages for a normal person. This, they could make it in the 1980s for about £8 ago. And that's why it's got the Open University logo all over it. So if you were studying science at home, they could send you a microscope. They could just put it in an envelope and send it to you. And so a whole set of people were able to study science who couldn't before. And I am a direct beneficiary of this because one of those people was my granddad, and he studied science and stopped working in the shipyard and became a science teacher. And then by the time I came around, there was enough money for me to go to university. So well done, Mr. MacArthur. So this is really important. But it's also important when people think about progress in science, that sometimes you can build on what everyone else has done, and sometimes actually you have to go back and say, well, what do I actually need to do, and can I do this differently? And then we have our final object, which is the one that makes me feel old, because children have no idea how to use this now. Once they get to secondary school, they are using calculators, but the thing they have most trouble with is they don't press buttons hard enough, because they've been told over and over again, don't press the iPad or whatever it is too hard, just tap it. And they just tap it, and nothing happens. And so it's the same as when we show them pictures in books and they try and make them bigger. It's like trying to explain making a woodcut, and like if you want to make it bigger, you have to carve it again with a different piece of wood. You know. But yes, so this is the one that makes me feel old. It's also one of the few modern things in our museum that works because it's solar powered. And that's a really interesting question for us as to what we collect next. Because once we've got something like a mobile phone, once all the operating systems don't work anymore, how am I going to explain that I used to spend 3 hours a day looking at this? So yes, the older things are almost always more fun to play with than the new ones. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm very happy to take questions. My official specialism is the entire history of all of science, which I haven't quite finished yet. So if I don't know, I'll just say I don't know, and you are welcome to come and have a look at the objects and touch them.